Hey, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co., and this video is 10 games that I thought would never ever leave my collection, but they did. And the reason I'm doing that video is because a few weeks ago I did a different video, 10 games I will never ever get rid of probably, and the probably is with great intent, because while it's true that I've learned a lot more about my gaming tastes over the years, I've learned a lot more about what is likely to stay or not stay, the point is that I've been wrong before, and I thought it'd be fun to go into the times where I was wrong. But before I do, a little word from our channel sponsor, which Gamefound is now a channel sponsor. And Gamefound, if you head on over to Gamefound, you can find Lords of Ragnarok from Awakened Realms, the spiritual successor to Lords of Hellas, a 1-to-4 player area control game in which you'll be taking control of various heroes at these gorgeous stun drop miniatures, attacking each other in one of 3 different victory conditions or 4 different victory conditions in order to win in this area control skirmish battler. The game launched on October 21st. It will end its Gamefound campaign on November 11th, and you can back now to get a free Valkyrie miniature. And with that, let's go and head on to the first game on this list, the first of 10 games that I thought would never ever leave my collection, and this one is A Few Acres of Snow. And for context, the order in which I'm ranking these games, the order that will go through these 10, is the order that I think I have the least amount of regret over. And going all the way to number 10 is a game I still debate whether I should get back. And we'll go into each of these one at a time. Timestamp as usual down below, you can check those out. But starting off with A Few Acres of Snow, this is a Martin Wallace game, and for a long time I adored this game. I still think it's an incredible game, but it's one that I've learned over time to see the flaws and to not be as enamored with it. A Few Acres of Snow is a 2-player head-to-head deck builder game, a deck builder game before deck building was cool, or at least before it was that cool, and it has a board, or so it's definitely before, it was a deck building game with a board, before deck building with a board was cool. And you'd fight facing off against each other, the British versus the French, the British versus Americans, heading off against each other in this game as you built up and expanded your settlements, as you chose the cards to add to your deck, as you chose actual abilities, as well as by the very nature of expanding would add cards to your deck, and then as you expanded you had less control over what your deck had, because sure, when you have 11 cards in your deck you have a decent amount of control over how things will play out. But when you have 30 cards in your deck, it's a lot less reliable to get the cards you need. The asymmetric nature of the game, the way the different factions had different strengths, and the British came in seemingly overpowered, and yet the French had a lot of control over what they could do, how they could do it, how they could attack the British and poke at them with they're using the natives to like steal cards, raid the settlement, to build up fortifications to defend. The game had a very push and pull, back and forth feel as you reacted your own strategies to accommodate and adjust to the other strategies of the other factions in the game. It's a game that I loved playing it for a very long time. I used to play this both physically in person, as well as I played on Yucata for years. I played it back and forth, 2 players head-to-head against different people on Yucata, because Yucata is an online site where you can play games, and I just enjoyed the process of the game. It's a game that I stopped playing after a certain point in time because I won against every single person I played it against. It became less fun for me because this is a game that I have like 50 plays of this game under my belt, which for most games in my collection, I don't have that volume. And those 50 plays, a good 30, 40 of them were within a year-long period as I learned to love this game. And that meant I became good at it and saw the various strategies. And yes, I specifically avoided looking up what the Halifax Hammer ever does, although to some extent at a certain point you can figure out some of what the Halifax Hammer strategy ends up doing. But either way, it's a strategy game, it's a game from Martin Wallace that I thoroughly enjoyed. It's the first Martin Wallace game that I learned to love, and I've still continued to love his designs over time. But I got rid of it because it was a game that, despite loving it, I was winning against everyone I played. And then years later, maybe a year or 2 ago, maybe, I tried getting it back with the hope that it's been enough time that I could play it again and enjoy it. And I did enjoy it, but I also started to see the flaws. You see, A Few Acres of Snow is one of the first 50 games that was in my collection ever. Somewhere in that range. It might have been the first 60, 70, I don't know exactly, but it was when my collection was still new and young, when I hadn't learned to experience everything. And it's one that over time, I found that when I returned to it, it wasn't so much an issue that I was winning or not, but rather an issue that the early game for this game was too predictable, too slow, too stale. I found the early game of A Few Acres of Snow was a very long build-up, a little more predictable build-up, and then the late game was a longer cycle of trying to manage your deck and ensure you get the right combinations. It's a game that has its moments, it has its tempo, it has its back-and-forth strategy, but it's one, while I still think of it as being a great game, it's one that I got rid of it a second time. I got it back, and I got rid of it a second time. That's one of the reasons it's first on this list as far as the least regrets. Because I had the regrets, I got it back, and I moved on from it. Next up, we have Small World. Small World is one that, this is the second ever, I want to say. This is the second, it was a Stone Age and Small World, I think so. Basically, my gaming journey started off with Catan, as many has, and then I played Catan for years and years and years. And then after playing Catan, eventually one day, my brother-in-law brought home Stone Age. And then a few months later, he brought home Small World. And thus began the descent into madness. Thus began starting to crawl online, find different stores, find different games, look into everything. And one of the first purchases I made was Small World, along with Stone Age. And in the case of Small World, I got all the expansions at the same time too. I got Cursed, I got Grand Dames, I got Tales, I got everything I could, because I adored the game. It's a game where you combine, you pick a faction, you pick an ability. We don't really pick them, they're combined automatically on the table, and then you bid to try to figure out, well, do I want this one because I'll have to pay more because that one just came out. You start putting down coins in different factions, and at a certain point, every combination of powers and abilities becomes worth it. At a certain point, the Dragon Master Ratmen may not have been worth it when they cost you 5 coins, but when it has 3 more coins on top of it and it only costs you 2, suddenly that's a different conversation. And so the game presents this puzzle of trying to figure out the optimal powers and abilities that they will combine. The race power as well as the just general faction power, whatever it is. You have the Hill Giants, you have the flying elves, the flying whatever. There's so much. The Flying Sorcerers, I think Flying Sorcerers was the overpowered one, but there's so many combinations of what you can do, and every combination works because you'll have to pay a variable amount of coins to get it, and or get paid to take that combo. In the meantime, you're trying to balance the fact that your races will go into decline as you play the game. You will slowly, inevitably go into decline. There's only so far you can spread across the board before you have to just give up and go into decline, choose another power, and go through it. Across the course of 10 rounds, you'll go through maybe 3 or 4 races, depending on what it is, maybe 2 to 4 races, depending on how far you push them, likely closer to 2 to 3, and you'll figure out how to get as many points as possible, as much income as possible, as you slowly push out others, attack others, in what is one of the gateway area control games I played. I love this game. I got everything for it, like absolutely everything. I got all the expansions. Then they came out with Small World Realms, and I got Small World Realms. And they came out with the Sky Islands, whatever it is, and I got that one. I sadly never played Sky Islands. I did play Realms. It's one that I really, really enjoyed. But then at a certain point, it lost its luster. The fun of the game is the combinations of the powers and abilities. The area control is actually a little too scripted, a little too obvious as far as what you have to do. There's usually an obvious pathway as you try to take over as much control, combined with a slightly nuanced aspect of, do you want to target the person who's in first place? And those two factors are all you really need to decide as you utilize your powers and abilities. It is an excellent game. It is a game I continuously recommend, but I still think it's a gateway game. I still think it's a game that some Days of Wonder has been responsible for having a ton of gateway games in my collection, from Shadows over Camelot to Ticket to Ride. The only one currently left is 5 Tribes, and even that one I don't get to the table as much as I would like to. But Small World was and is an excellent experience, but one that eventually I got bored of. They even had that $300 collector's one or whatnot. I didn't get that one, but I still kind of wanted to. But yeah, I don't really have regrets for this one. I have the app. I occasionally dive into the app briefly for a round or two. I enjoy it, but it's not one that I feel the need to own anymore. Number 3 is Pandemic. Pandemic, this is a game that I had. This is the longest lasting game in my collection that I also got rid of. You see, from my initial games, from my initial purchase of games that I got when I first got into the hobby, I still have 2 left. The third one, the one that was the closest to those 2 being longest standing, was Pandemic. Pandemic is a game that I got the game. It was my first cooperative experience, and it's a game that I played with my wife. I enjoyed it. I remember we got the game, we learned the game, I set it up on the floor. It was literally in the floor of our apartment. Or was it a house? Was it after must have been in a house by then, just thinking timeline wise. And we set it up on the floor of our house. We had a 6-month-old baby, and we just played Pandemic. I learned the rules, we played it, we won, we lost, I played it again, we won, we lost. Again, this is back when I actually played games 15, 20, 30 times before moving on to the next one. I still play a lot of games, but now I play a game 5, 6 times, and then it goes into the cycle and occasionally hits. The amount of games that get 30 plays is rare, but Pandemic is one of those games that absolutely has 30 plays under our belts. This is a game that my wife and I enjoyed it so much, we played it again and again and again. And then Pandemic Legacy came out. And we got Pandemic Legacy because Pandemic Legacy was doing the same thing but with a story, and it was being talked about, and people were obsessed with the concept of a game that destroys itself, and you rip up cards and you go through this stuff. This looks like baby Pandemic. Is this really this does not look. This has been so long since I saw the original board for Pandemic that I don't even recognize this. You see, nowadays they have the new one. Nowadays they have the new art version of Pandemic, which is this board over here, and this is the one I'm more used to seeing. But even after Pandemic Legacy, even after playing Pandemic Legacy, as we went through the cooperative game of having diseases spread across the map, of utilizing our actions and our special abilities to try to rein things in control, I still occasionally went back to Pandemic. but not as much as I would have liked to. Not as much as it's one that I kept in. We had all the expansions I had in a broken token crate. I loved the concept of the game, but we didn't table it enough. And I've played Pandemic Legacy twice. I've played Pandemic Legacy 2 twice. We have Pandemic Legacy Season 0, and I do plan on diving into that one as well, and I don't know what else the future of Pandemic holds. There still are offshoots. There's Pandemic Iberia, there's Pandemic Rome, there's Pandemic... Well, we have the new World of Warcraft Pandemic. There is a ton of offshoots in the Pandemic universe, and I realized at a certain point that I think my access to Pandemic is going to continue to come through the various offshoots and expansions, that I will try them out to experience them, but I no longer table the original Pandemic as much as I would like to. It's one that I was forcing myself to table out of nostalgia for that game. A great game, but one that I had played out, so to speak. I had played it enough times that I was ready to move on to the next one. And speaking of the next one is Seasons. This is another game that I got back, and another game that I got rid of again after getting it back, and yet it's still the fourth one on this list. I still want this game. There's so many things Pandemic does that I love, and if you've watched my channel, you know that I love powers and abilities, and the draft and the powers and abilities in Seasons is such a fun part of the game. It drives me in every single time. That you start the game with a pre-game draft where you go through all these cards, just tons of cards, and the way they intermingle, the way they interweave, and they give you different options as you try to figure out how to manage your currencies. You're going to try to get this card, you'll use this card in the first round, because once you get your 9 cards, you have to figure out exactly which phases you're using them in. Each phase is going to have 3 cards. You have to try to balance it out and decide, well, I know I want all these cards, but I'll have these 3 cards in the first age, these 3 cards in the second age, these 3 are endgame scoring cards, so you'll figure that out. Along the way, you'll draw other cards as well as the game progresses, and you'll try to be balancing all that together while you manage your power, while you manage the resources. You're trying to build up a combination of powers and abilities that will give you the best return you possibly can get in this game as you convert things to crystals. I still love the power draft. The power draft in Seasons is one of the best drafts I have in any game that I've played. The power draft just continuously offers me it offers me the promise of how the game will play out. It offers me the promise of an incredible experience that I will love diving into time and time again. The problem is the actual gameplay past that tends to devolve a little bit into just this crystal churning thing that feels like a lack of theme as you go through it. You'll be rolling these dice, these season dice, and choosing them and trying to gather crystals and convert the various energy tokens into crystals depending on the phase you have. I love the power draft in the game, but the rest of the game feels like a little bit of an exercise in math and slightly anticlimactic to what is otherwise an excellent experience. I played with one of the expansions. I own both. I played with one of the expansions. This is a game that, again, I got it back, and I found that I played it once or twice, but then I got rid of it again, and I still kind of partially want it back. It might be a while before I decide to get it back again. Any game that I got rid of twice usually stays gone. Usually. I wonder if there's any exceptions to that. But overall, I really, really enjoyed Seasons. There was absolutely a point. There was a point when this was my... there's whenever you do a password thing that says, what's your password hint? What was the city you got married in or whatever? There were a bunch of sites out there, good luck finding them, where my password hint to all the questions was just Seasons. Because I love this game. When I played it and I got to know the cards and abilities, I was obsessed with it. I made it my password hint for dozens of websites. To this day, some of those websites still have my password hint. It's just Seasons. If you ever try to log in as me at a bank or something like that, well, my banks are actually safe because I'm not that crazy. But at some other sites, it'll be like, what's the name of your first pet? Seasons. Where did you meet your wife? Seasons. What's the name of the first car? What type of car did you first own? Seasons. Clearly this is a game that I thought I would keep forever. Moving on, we have Cosmic Encounter. Cosmic Encounter is an amazing game. This was in my top 10 at one point. In fact, one of the things, I don't necessarily know where my top 10 was at any given point because I didn't always have top 10s. But the first time I put together a top 10, Cosmic Encounter was on that list. The very first time it was on the list. There are some other games, by the way, other games that did not make this list. So for instance, Kingdom Builder was at one point in my top 10, and it's gone now. But it didn't make this list because I replaced it with Winter Kingdom. Same thing with Seventh Continent, an incredible experience. But I got rid of it because I'm getting Seventh Citadel. Those games I don't count as getting rid of when I upgraded it with a newer version of the game. I don't count it as leaving my collection. It's a proxy, so to speak. So those games didn't make the list. But Cosmic Encounter is and was an incredible negotiation experience. You have boxes full of aliens. If you have all the expansions, and I had tons of expansions, if you have all the expansion cards, you have boxes full of aliens, all giving you an asymmetric power, a way to play the game as you go through this tactical game of figuring out how you're going to utilize your power to end up ganging up against your enemies to ultimately get 5 colonies across the board. That's the game here. The game is a simple process of trying to attack other colonies, invite others to ally with you, play various cards to get what you want, and then the powers drive the entire game. The powers and the power cards from the various factions, that drives the game. It is such a fun experience, and it's such a interesting experience that is infinitely variable, near infinitely variable, because of how many powers there are out there. And there's a whole bunch of modular expansion stuff as well. I never really touched those. I only really went for the powers and aliens and all those things to have different experiences. And to this day, we still have stories of Cosmic Encounter. We still have stories of the time that one of our friends self-destructed 2 of his own planets just to deny someone else the win, but he blew up his own planets, and that's such a cool part of the game. There's a time where I was the butler, and I had to say, yes sir, please sir, may I sir, to all the interactions I had with other players if I wanted to actually get what I needed. The game has character, it has party elements, it has strategy. The butler had actual benefits to that as well, but you had to be polite along the way. I think it was the butler. I don't remember the faction, but you had this element of you could get a benefit, but you had to be polite, throwing a degree of whimsicalness into this game. And the game, to a certain extent, is self-balancing because of the way that a power might be too strong in one way, shape, or form, but then the other players balance around that through the way they invite others to those negotiations. And it's a game where you can win together, and you get down to that pivotal moment of potentially negotiating for a mutual binary win, which could be equally as amazing as then being screwed out of that win by your opponent. There's so much energy in this game. It is such a good experience when you have it. And yet eventually I got rid of it because it is a game that it is an incredible story. But I think the gameplay is borderline predictable. Predictable is probably a strong word. I'll probably have like 50 people who are like, how dare you, sir? Yeah, it's fair. It's not predictable. I think the elements and the mechanics of the game are not the kind that I typically want, not to the level I want. What drives the engine forward is the variability of the aliens, but the rest of the game is you fall into a routine of how you play it past the alien powers. I still like it, and it's a game that only plays best at 5 in my opinion. 4 is too little, 6 is too long. To me, I'll only play this game at 5. It's one that I'm still happy to play nowadays. It's just one that I eventually got rid of because it wasn't a game that I saw hitting the table when I had that 5-player count. Maybe one day I'll get it back again. Again, all these games, they're all tentatively possible. I think the only 3 that I'm certain I'm not getting back are A Few Acres of Snow, Small World, and Pandemic. The rest are potentially. We'll see. Speaking of getting things back, we have Ra. Ra by Reina Knizia. Ra is such an excellent experience, and it still hurts that I got rid of it, but I'm still okay with the fact that I got rid of it. It is an excellent game, but an excellent game that to a certain extent I had played out. This one, more so than Cosmic Encounter, falls into the predictable nature of the gameplay. It is the best auction game, the best pure auction game I ever played, but we played it enough times that going through that cycle, playing it again and again, pulling it out, it's one that stopped hitting the table because we had gone through it enough times. We had gone through the cycle of calling Ra, of gathering the buildings, of pairing up the buildings, of going for the various workers, the plague, all these different things. The core concept of the game is you're putting down different cards, and then at any point you're putting down different tiles that will be bid on, and at any point you can call Ra, triggering an auction, which does mean you get to bid last, which gives you an advantage that other players don't have. Or alternatively, a raw tile will come out and you don't really necessarily have the choice of what happens. So you can be either controlling your own destiny or the victim to whatever they decide, whatever the gods decide. But then past that, you have an auction at play, and now in this auction, what you have to do is you have to take these various tiles and figure out what benefit and incentive do you have to bid your sun tiles, to bid your tiles, to gather these tiles that you need in order to fill out your tableau. How is the scoring going to work each round? Which tiles do you need? How much does the other person next to you need them? Because they may need them less than you, but they might have more currency left to spend or more of these sun tiles. So it's this constant balance of trying to figure out what you need before the round ends. Do that across 3 ages, and that basically is the game of Ra. It is beautifully well done. It is one of Reina Knizia's best works, and it's just a game that I played enough over like 7 years or something like that, however long I had it, that I was ready to move on from it. But I still love it. It's still a great game. And again, the very nature that it's on this point of the list means it is potentially possible that I will get this one back. And then next up we have Alien Frontiers. Alien Frontiers is, I believe, the first Kickstarter I backed. And to be clear, I didn't back the original Kickstarter for Alien Frontiers. Rather, I backed the like rocket dice or whatever it is. I backed some expansion for Alien Frontiers. Did I get the rocket dice? I don't remember getting the rocket dice. Now I'm a little wondering. Now I'm wondering if I ever got the rocket dice for this game. This is a different problem. Maybe I got factions. Maybe I was done with it by the time they had the rocket dice. I think that might have been it. I think I got the factions and the factions expansion. No, we're all good. We're all good. I got that. So I backed the factions content for the game. They had Alien Frontiers factions. They had a whole bunch of content for it. But this was this was the first Kickstarter I backed, I believe, or one of the first. Flashpoint may have been the first. Alien Frontiers was a game that I loved. I played at 2 players. It's not an ideal at 2 players game. It's recommended at 2 players, but it's really best at 3 and 4 players. And most of my plays were at 2 players, and I loved it because what it was doing was so incredible. And then eventually I played it at 3 players, and I was like, it's even better. The whole area control aspect of the moon is much more tense and tough at 3 players, and this is a better 3-player game, and I adored the experience. And it's such a good game. It's a game that I want to get back now. Even just looking at it right now, I want to get it back. See, ultimately it's a dice placement game. You roll your dice and you assign them to different areas. You can slowly try to build colonies in the moon by slowly progressing them across this bottom left. You can put 2 cards together to turn these resources. You can go to the alien artifact cards, where you have to give up cards to equal the various, you have to give up cards dice greater than 7 to get a card for the market. You can go to the lunar mine to get ore. You can go to the up here to get solar. You can go to the shipyard to get more ships. So you have to give in dice plus energy to get more ships. Dice have to equal each other. There's all these different options in terms of what you can do. You can go to the terraforming station, where you can turn in a 6. Giving up one of your ships, your spaceship dice, in order to get a colony faster, but you're giving up a ship along the way. All these things are giving you different options as far as how you get what you want, but you're placing your dice in various spots, either in sequence or for totals or equaling each other, all to get what you need from the experience. And then the colonies all have their benefits. They all have their reasons why to go to one colony versus another. The alien artifacts gave you powers and abilities, different ways to mix up the experience. The factions expansion gave you all this more content for the game. I adored Alien Frontiers, and I didn't think it would ever leave. But over time, we always picked Castles of Burgundy. That's why eventually this one left. I love Alien Frontiers. I still think it's a solid game. But over time, as time went on, more and more, I found that my wife and I picked Castles of Burgundy. And this is back when 90% of my games were with my wife. This is before I had developed a game group, and so 90% of my plays were exclusively with my wife, and we picked Castles of Burgundy time and time again. And so eventually, Alien Frontiers did leave the collection. I still look back on it fondly. I still wonder whether I should get it back and play it and try it with my game group, see how it is. There are aspects of the game that I still really, really appreciate. But again, it's been a long time. This is one of the first games I played. And my gaming tastes have constantly gotten more... I've been exposed to more and more games that, even from like GameSloot themselves, they now have they took over Starling Games, and they now have Everdell, which I'd much rather play Everdell than Alien Frontiers. I'd rather play Castles of Burgundy than Alien Frontiers. But there was a point where Alien Frontiers was a game that I thought would never leave. And then we have Tigris and Euphrates, the most recent game on this list to leave the collection. Tigris and Euphrates, making Reiner Knizia the only person on this list to have 2 games. The designer of this list to have 2 different games on this list. Tigris and Euphrates is an amazing experience. It is absolutely amazing. It's not even a question. This is number 3 in terms of 3 down. These are the games that I potentially could see myself getting back, absolutely. See, Tigris and Euphrates is a game where you're going to be placing your various tiles down into these areas to try to get points, which is a simplistic way of putting it, but that's what you're doing. You'll place down a tile, and if you have a leader in that domain, you get a point. The problem is you'll get different colored points depending on the tiles you put out, and so you're trying to branch out and diversify, because at the end of the game your score is equal to the points you have the fewest of. So if you have 10 blue, 10 red, 10 black, and 3 green, your score is 3 green. And that's where the puzzle comes in, because you can be amazing at getting all the blue tiles you want. It doesn't necessarily help you unless you properly plan around how to take control of monuments, how to have battles, how to take control of one another. And that's where the meat of the game comes in, the eternal revolts or the external battles that you have in order to take control of regions, because no matter how powerful someone seems to be, there's always something you can do to get in their way. There's always a catastrophe tile you can play to mix up their empire. There's always an internal revolt you can have where you can take over because they didn't plan according to whatever, and you have 4 reds behind your screen, and suddenly you're the new king, the new leader of that region. And then there's battles. You can sit there and start building up your battles. Focus on building up your black tiles over here, so eventually you can connect the 2 kingdoms, and now between that, you throw in some extra blacks behind your screen, and boom, again, you win. There's so many ways to min-max. There's so many ways to attack and assault somebody who is well entrenched in this game, but that's not enough, because you have to be sure to do it in a way that hurts them the most. You have to attack them where they're weakest. If they don't have enough blue cubes coming in, attack them at their blue, because it doesn't matter how strong they are. It doesn't matter how many monuments they control and how many extra tokens they have coming in from their other areas. You have to just attack them where they're weakest. Stop them from getting treasures. Treasures are these tokens that will act as wilds at the end of the game, inherently enhancing your score from wherever it is. Stop them from getting those. Tigris and Euphrates is such a good game. I still have, to my credit, I still have Yellow and Yangtze from Reiner Knizia, which is the newer version of Tigris and Euphrates. I plan on giving that a shot. My understanding and impression is that Tigris and Euphrates is still the better respected game, but I like the game system enough that I have to give Yellow and Yangtze a try. The reason Tigris and Euphrates left is simply because that time aspect. Over time, it is a game that I have played so many times, and it's a game where I've played Tigris and Euphrates maybe 15, 20, probably more at this point. I've probably played like 20, 30 times Tigris and Euphrates. I've had it for like 8 years. But then I found that I was playing it against people in my game group who'd played it 2 times or 3 times. And it's a game where I always won. And that, combined with the amount of times I played it, found that I stopped having fun playing Tigris Euphrates. I saw the strategy better than other players at my table because of how many times I've played it over the years. This is a potential problem with all my games, by the way. The very nature of most games in my collection is I play them over time with all the people in my game group, and then other people in my game group play it slowly over time, and so as time goes on, I'll eventually hit 15 plays when somebody else hits 3 or 4 plays. It's becoming less of a problem right now because my game group is actually a little bit more focused on the same people as opposed to it was for a long time very spread out. But even so, it's still a potential problem. But either way, Tigris Euphrates is a game that I don't have regrets getting rid of it, but it's absolutely possible that it may well become a game that one day I get back. And then we have Merchants and Marauders. I love this game. It's such a good experience. To this date, Merchants and Marauders is potentially the best sandbox exploration game I've played. The only other one in this category is going to be Xia Legends of a Drift System. The reason Merchants and Marauders is on this list instead of Xia is because I never played Merchants and Marauders. I never played Xia quite as much. Xia is Xia, I can never know how to pronounce it, but I never played that one quite as much. I played that one 2 or 3 times, and eventually I saw it wasn't hitting the table because I got it later in my gaming life, where I already had a lot more competition for the table. Merchants and Marauders, on the other hand, was one of the first games I got. And so to that end, it's a game that I played it extensively. Again, going back to that playing a 2-player with my wife, I played this extensively, 2 players with my wife, and really enjoyed it. And I played it 3 or 4 once or twice, and I found that it wasn't an experience I wanted to repeat as much. The player interaction was greater, but the length of the game was significantly longer. If you play a 4-player game of Merchants and Marauders, it can run you 3.5, 4 hours, which makes it a little harder to table. Versus playing a 2-player with my wife means you'd knock out a game in 2.5 hours tops, and I really, really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed the nature of the merchant or marauder approach, the AI ships that would wander around the board, the trying to figure out where and how you can best upgrade your ship, where you can drop off your resources, how you can ultimately get the 10 points you need to win the game, if you're playing a 10-point game. I really, really like Merchants and Marauders. And it's a game that I absolutely adored what it was doing, and it's so painful when I eventually did get rid of it. But it's one that I did get rid of because over time I stopped playing with my wife. And like I said already, it was too long a game to play at game night in comparison with other games we were playing. I could play the 3.5, 4 hour long Merchants Marauders, or I can play other games that I enjoy just as much but were shorter and potentially get 2 of those in. I still think Merchants Marauders is incredible at what it's doing. This is the same designer of Clash of Cultures, which we just recently got the Monumental Edition. I will not lie. If this thing shows up on Kickstarter as some sort of new Merchants Marauders Monumental Edition, I don't know if I'll have the self-control to say no. I don't know if I'll play it either. Time will tell. But I'll get it with the intent to play, and we'll see. Merchants Marauders is absolutely a game that I want to play again. If I show up at a convention, there's so many games that I mentally lie to myself and tell myself, hey, I'll just play them at conventions. I'll just show up in the future. Someone else will have a copy. I'll play it there. But there's only so many games I can actually own in my collection. But I did, for a long time, think that Merchants Marauders would never, ever leave. And that brings us to the last one on this list. The last game I thought would never leave. I'm sure there's others. I just picked the top 10 that I could think of, which is Shogun. Shogun from Durken. This is a Queen Games game. This is a classic game. It's gotten the whole big box treatment because, of course, it has. This is such a good area control game. And it's one that I adored for such a long time. It has this aspect of playing these cards. Let's see if we can show over here. You're playing these cards. You're trying to pick provinces where actions will take place. So you're playing these different province cards to your player board, defining what actions will happen when. But you can only read 5 cards out in advance. So there's a little bit of thinking through how you're going to handle things as you try to plan where you're going to move, where you're going to recruit, where you're going to build, what options are you going to take. So it has a degree of hidden programming, a degree of trying to outthink your opponent. It has a cube tower which I can take or leave, where you drop cubes into the tower. This is something that was popular at some point with the Queen Games, although they're bringing it back with Marrakesh and Stefan Feld. They're bringing back a cube tower, so it's not gone yet. But I think Shogun was the game that popularized the cube tower. They also have another game. He has another game that does the same thing called Wallenstein. Wallenstein and Shogun are basically the same game, minor rules changes, different maps, same basic game. It is such a good experience. Shogun was possibly, I'd have to think it through, but I think Shogun was the first, I'm going to call it a big boy area control game. We had Small World in our group, in our collection, but I think Shogun was the first area control experience that our group started to dive into once we moved past Small World. And we loved it. And it was so good. It is so good. It is on this list at the first spot because it's a game that even now I frequently look at this game and think, I should get that back. And I don't know how much of it's nostalgia. I don't know if it would or wouldn't hold up. I think it's a really, really good game, but I'm also comparing it to games nowadays that I play like Kemet, like Blood Rage, like Cyclades, like Inish. There are so many amazing area control games. I don't know if Shogun would hit the table, but it is and was so good at what it's doing. I might get this one back. No promises. But whether I do or don't, it doesn't change the fact that at a certain point, I thought Shogun would never ever leave the collection, and sadly and unfortunately, it did. Or fortunately, it depends. It's always about making these choices. This entire list, every single game in this list, including every single game I put in the top 10 games that would never leave the collection probably last time, they represent where I am now. They represent what I like now, what I think it works for me in the moment. And if I ever do get rid of them, it's never a sad thing. It's because other things have come along and shown themselves to be competitors for that time and attention. If I get rid of a game that I thought would never ever leave, it's not a sad day. It means, well, unless it's because I stopped playing games, in which case it is a sad day. But if not for that, it's because something came along that potentially did it better. Something came along that captured my imagination more. And yes, the nostalgia is always there, and the desire to play is always there, but there's only so much time in the gaming day, and choices have to be made. I don't like keeping games on the shelf. As soon as I realize that a game is not likely to be played, I don't like having it on the shelf. Because if I'm going to pick something else every time, why am I owning you? Why do I have this mental obligation to know the rules? Why do I have this physical space, this monetary value being taken up by something that won't get played? Any of these games that I ever get back, it's because I think that the nostalgia combined with the game is enough that I will get it played. And when I've done that, sometimes I'm right. Sometimes there are games that I got back. Everdell, which I mentioned earlier in this video, is a game that I got rid of and got back. And now I adore it and I get it played as much as I possibly can. There are some games that I change my mind on and I realize I should. There are some games that leave the collection, come back, and I'm like, I'm so glad to see you again. But other times not. Other times they left for a reason. And despite how much I love them at a certain point in time, they may not be a right fit for me anymore. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a good one.